Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The sun had barely settled over the dusty rooftops of Amakwa village when Adora trudged home from school, her uniform stained with red sand, and her eyes heavy with tears. She held a crumpled sheet of paper in her hand. Her school fees reminder. The headmistress had summoned her that afternoon and in a firm voice said, "Adora, if you don't bring the balance by Friday, don't bother coming back." It wasn't said with malice, but the word stung like venom. As she passed by Mama Ebra's compound, she didn't even greet as she normally did. She simply sat on the edge of a rock near the old woman's gate and sobbed quietly. Her parents, Chibuzo and Ifyinanya, were kind but broken people. Chibuzo worked long hours under the sun molding blocks for houses he could never afford, while Ifyinanya sold roasted corn near the motor park. Their combined earnings could barely feed the family of 5. School fees were luxury. That evening, Mama Ebra watched through the rusted netting of her window, her own frail body wrapped in a faded wrapper, listening to the girls' muffled cries. Her heart tightened. Inside her dimly lit room, Mama Ebra sat quietly on a worn mat that smelled of old fabric and camphor. The radio hadn't worked in years, and the only sound that kept her company was the echo of silence, a silence that had stretched across the years since her husband and daughter died. But Adora's cries had pierced that silence today. They reminded her too much of another child who once cried for help, a child who no longer breathed. She leaned forward and coughed into her hand, spitting a tiny streak of blood into a piece of cloth she kept close. The sickness was worsening. Her back ached constantly, and she could barely stand for more than 5 minutes without feeling dizzy. Still, something stirred inside her, a restless warmth she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know the girl deeply, but she had watched her grow from a skinny toddler to a young, intelligent student. She often waved at her from the gate, and sometimes brought her small mangoes or guava fruits. But today, seeing her cry like that broke something loose in her spirit. She whispered to herself, "China and I would have been her age now," and wiped a tear from her cheek. That night, while the moon cast its pale glow over the village, and the crickets sang their ancient lullabies, Mama Ebra lay awake. Her mind wandered through memories and regrets. The little box under her bed held all she had left, a few thousand naira she had saved for her burial rites, knowing her end was near. But what was the point of saving to die when someone else's chance to live was bleeding right before her eyes? She stared at the roof as if it would speak, and then she made a decision, one that made her chest feel both light and heavy at the same time. She would give the girl that money, all of it, let death come when it would. But before it did, she wanted to know that one more child got a chance. The next morning, even before Adora could return to her rock of sorrow, Mama Ebra was already waiting with trembling hands and a sealed envelope. Her heart pounded not out of fear, but out of something she hadn't felt in a long time, purpose. The morning sun had barely kissed the earth when Mama Ebra pulled herself from the creaking bed. Her joints protested as usual, but her spirit felt strangely alive. She pulled the box from beneath her bed, the one with a broken padlock and faded edges. Inside were 2 wrappers neatly folded, an old portrait of her late husband, and a polythene bag filled with crisp and rumpled naira notes she had managed to save over the years. Some came from selling local herbs, others from the kindness of a few villagers who still remembered Obina's generosity before his death. That money was not meant for the living. It was her funeral plan. But today it was going to change someone's destiny. She sat quietly, counting slowly. 10,000, 12,000. It wasn't much, but for a family like Adora's, it was a miracle. Her eyes welled up with tears as she folded the money into an envelope and sealed it with trembling hands. "This is for China and I," she whispered. "Wherever you are, this is for you." By the time Adora approached the compound that morning, still carrying the weight of hopelessness, she was surprised to see the old woman already seated on a bench, dressed in a neatly tied ankara wrapper and a scarf that had seen better days. "Come, my daughter," Mama Ebra called, her voice soft but commanding. Adora approached slowly, wiping her tears. I saw you crying yesterday, the widow said. You remind me of someone I once knew. Sit. The girl obeyed, nervous. Without another word, Mama Ebra placed the envelope in her hands. Use it for your school fees. At first, Adora stared in disbelief, then opened it slightly. Her breath caught. Mama, this is too much. I can't take this, she said, tears flooding her eyes. But the woman gently held her wrist. Take it. I have no one. My daughter would have been your age. Let me do this not for you, but for her. You're her in my eyes now. Adora wept, falling to her knees, holding the woman's frail legs tightly. She didn't have the words to thank her, only tears. That day, as Adora rushed home with the envelope clutched to her chest, the sun seemed brighter. Her parents were stunned when she told them what had happened. Her mother wept openly while her father went down on his knees, lifting both hands in prayer. They had nothing to repay the kindness, but that didn't matter to Mama Ebra. She watched Adora run down the road and felt something shift inside her, not just emotionally, but physically. The tightness in her chest loosened. The fog in her mind cleared a bit. For the first time in years, the compound did not feel empty. She had nothing left in savings, no wealth to boast of, and her health was still failing. But her soul felt rich. As she returned to her room, she looked up and whispered, "Oh, Binna, China and I did something good today. I hope you saw it." Her heart had given, and in that giving, it had begun to heal, even if just a little. Many years ago, before sickness made her bones brittle and silence replaced the laughter in her home, Ebra was a radiant young woman known across a Makwa village for her beauty and grace. She met Obinna when she was just 19, and he was the handsome young son of a retired schoolteacher. Their love blossomed quickly, fierce and full of dreams. Villagers often said they were joined by heaven. He was respectful, hard-working, and never lifted his voice at her. Their love was not loud or flashy. It was gentle and grounded. In their little bungalow near the stream, they lived modestly, but with joy. Ebra cooked his favorite yam porridge, and he brought home flowers he plucked along the road. They laughed over silly jokes and danced barefoot in the rain. It was a kind of love young girls in the village envied, and older women whispered about with knowing smiles. But then, years began to pass, and something was missing, a child. At first, they weren't too worried. "It will come," Obinna would say, kissing her forehead. "Let's enjoy ourselves first." But after 3 years, the whispers began. Neighbors started watching her stomach, and family members began offering unsolicited herbal advice. After 5 years, the whispers became open comments. Women would jokingly call her Mama Nothing when she passed by. Her mother-in-law once handed her a bundle of roots and said, "Try this, before my son forgets you're a woman." The shame grew heavy. Ebra would cry quietly at night, her head buried in her husband's chest. Yet, Obinna never blamed her. He would wipe her tears and whisper, "You're enough for me even without a child." But society was unkind. Weddings they once attended together became lonely events for her. Baby showers became painful reminders. Her faith began to shake, and even though she continued to fast and pray, each month that ended without conception felt like a knife twisting deeper into her heart. 10 years into their marriage, Ebra had become a shadow of herself. She avoided gatherings, and her once vibrant laughter became rare. Obinna never changed. He stood by her, defending her honor even when family members encouraged him to take another wife. But deep down, she knew he was suffering too. Sometimes she'd catch him staring longingly at children playing in the compound. Still, they clung to each other, bound by something deeper than fertility. And then, at the edge of her hope, when her body had started to slow and her spirit was tired, a miracle happened. She missed her cycle, then the next. She dismissed it as menopause, until the village nurse confirmed it. She was pregnant. The tears she cried that day soaked the clinic floor. The heavens had opened for her. The same people who mocked her began bringing gifts. Her husband wept openly, dancing and singing through the streets. That child, that long-awaited gift, would be named Chinanai, because truly God had given. The cruelest thing about barrenness was not just the emptiness of the womb, but the sharpness of the words it attracted. After her 5th year of marriage, Ebra began noticing how people's smiles twisted when they looked at her. The very women who once admired her beauty and grace began to speak in whispers when she passed. Some pretended to greet her warmly, only to sneer behind her back. One neighbor, a heavily built woman named Neka, often said loud enough for her to hear, "What use is beauty if your womb is as dry as harmattan firewood?" It wasn't just the women. Even children started picking up on the ridicule. One afternoon, as Ebra returned from the market, a little boy shouted, "Auntie Ebra, you're not a real mummy, right?" She forced a smile, but her eyes stung all the way home. In their culture, motherhood wasn't just desired, it was expected. And when it didn't come, a woman wasn't just pitied. She was seen as cursed. Her in-laws were not kind either. Though Obinna defended her fiercely, his mother was particularly venomous. She would sit in their compound and wail dramatically, "My son has no heir. What kind of woman is this?" When Ebra brought food to her, she'd push it away and mutter about wasted blessings. You eat and sleep while other women carry life in their bellies. During family gatherings, cousins and aunties would brag about their children's achievements and then turn to her, asking with fake concern, "Ebra, how are you holding up? Don't worry, God's time is the best," their tone laced with pity that stung worse than insults. Ebra often returned from such meetings to cry into her pillow. Even church became unbearable. Every sermon on fruitfulness felt like a direct attack. Women gave testimonies of giving birth after 2 years of marriage, and she clapped with shaking hands, hiding the storm in her soul. And yet, through all this, Obinna never wavered. Every night, he held her and prayed with her. He planted kisses on her forehead and reminded her of her worth. "You are my blessing," he'd say, even as he grieved in private. Sometimes, Ebra would wake up in the middle of the night and see him looking at old baby clothes they had once bought in faith. He'd wipe his tears quickly, but she saw them. They were both breaking slowly, trying to hold each other up. She began fasting every Monday and Friday, refusing food until sundown. She would kneel before God and weep bitterly, asking for mercy. Her hair thinned from stress. Her body lost its curves. She grew quiet, reserved, and withdrawn. But in her heart, one ember still burned. The hope that one day, just one day, she'd carry her own child. That ember was all she had left, and she protected it like a dying flame in a cold, bitter wind. The news came like the quiet flutter of a butterfly, delicate and surreal. It started with a missed period, which Ebra dismissed with bitter amusement. "It's menopause," she said to herself. "Age is finally claiming me." But then another month passed, and another. Her body began to feel strange, her breast sore, her stomach unsettled. At first, she was too scared to hope, but Obinna insisted they visit the clinic. The nurse, a plump and cheerful woman named Chioma, examined her and chuckled. "Auntie, you are not entering menopause, you're entering motherhood." Ebra blinked. "What did you say?" Chioma smiled again and handed her a strip. "You are pregnant, madam." That moment shattered every wall inside her. She sat there trembling, mouth agape, as years of shame, pain, and prayer came crashing into her spirit. She burst into uncontrollable tears, not of sadness, but of long-awaited joy. Obinna knelt beside her, burying his face in her lap, weeping like a child. The other patients in the waiting room soon gathered outside, peeking in, murmuring in awe. Word spread fast. The same women who once mocked her now came bearing gifts. They brought coconuts, eggs, wrappers, and even cash. They praised her resilience and called her Mama Patience. She received their offerings with quiet grace, but she never forgot. Never forgot the sting of their words, the loneliness, the rejection. But now wasn't the time for bitterness. It was time for joy. Her pregnancy was not smooth. Her body was older and weaker, but her spirit carried strength no science could explain. She sang to her belly every morning and prayed over it at night. She avoided stress and rested well, often lying in Obinna's arms, humming the lullabies she would someday sing to her baby. When labor finally came, it was difficult. The midwives feared the worst. But after hours of agony, a cry pierced the air, the cry of life. A girl. Healthy, beautiful, and strong. They named her Chinanai, God gives. And truly, she was heaven's gift. The baby became the center of their world. Ebra held her constantly, breathing in the scent of her hair, watching her every movement as if afraid she'd vanish. Obina built a small crib from scratch, decorating it with beads and colorful cloth. They celebrated every milestone, her first tooth, her first word, her first steps, with uncontainable joy. The home that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter and lullabies. People who had once judged them now came to learn from them. "How did you wait so long and not give up?" they asked. Ebra only smiled and said, "Some things are worth the wait." She poured every ounce of love into her daughter. She sang to her while cooking, danced with her under the moonlight, and carried her on her back even when her knees ached. Chinanai became not just a child, but a healing balm. The sun had returned to Ebra's life, warm, golden, and glorious. Chinanai's laughter became the music of the house. From the moment she could crawl, she was into everything: pots, baskets, broomsticks. She followed her mother like a shadow, pulling her wrapper, climbing into her lap uninvited, and talking nonstop about everything she saw. Ebra didn't mind. She cherished every word, every gesture. Their mornings began with giggles and ended with lullabies. Chinanai would sit on the kitchen stool watching her mother stir soup, asking curious questions about pepper, salt, and firewood. Ebra answered them all patiently, loving the way the girl's eyes sparkled with curiosity. When Obina returned from his farm, Chinanai would leap into his arms with a shriek, wrapping her arms around his neck. He'd lift her high into the air, spin her around, and call her my princess. The house, once lonely and hollow, had become a sanctuary of joy. Ebra would walk Chinanai to school every day, holding her hand tightly, even after she was old enough to walk alone. Other mothers teased her for babying the child, but she didn't care. She had waited almost 2 decades for this. She wasn't going to rush a second of it. On the way to school, they would pick flowers, sing songs, and talk about what Chinanai wanted to become. "A teacher," she'd shout one day. "A nurse," another. Ebra would laugh and say, "Whatever you want, I will be there clapping." And she meant it. She attended every school open day, every cultural dance, every prize-giving day. Even when Chinanai didn't win anything, she'd bring her snacks and whisper, "You're always my winner." Obina too remained ever present, building her swings from tree branches, teaching her to plant cassava, telling her stories under the moonlight. They weren't rich in money, but in love they overflowed. Sundays were the best. They would dress in matching clothes, Ebra in her lace, Chinanai in a miniature version, and Obina in a matching shirt. At church, they sat together, with Chinanai often dozing off in her mother's arms before the end of the sermon. After church, they'd share a simple meal, jollof rice and fried plantains, then gather in the living room to dance to old high-life music. On one such Sunday, Ebra sat back and watched her husband dancing with their daughter, both of them laughing with abandon. Her eyes filled with tears, but not from sadness. "God," she whispered, "thank you. Even if this is all I ever have, it is enough." She didn't know then how fleeting joy could be, but in that moment it was perfect. Their small house stood not just on soil, but on memories, memories that would soon become the only thing she'd have left. There was something sacred about the way Chinanai looked at her mother, as though the bond they shared stretched beyond mere blood into the realm of the divine. Ebra would often wake in the middle of the night to find Chinanai curled beside her, one small hand clutching her wrapper, her breathing soft and even. It was these little things, the silent gestures, that told Ebra her daughter loved her just as fiercely as she loved her. Their conversations were endless, stretching from what Chinanai dreamed about to the names of stars in the sky. Ebra answered every question with patience, never growing tired of her daughter's need to know everything. She taught her how to grind pepper with a stone, how to plait hair, how to fry akara, and how to kneel in reverence when greeting elders. And in return, Chinanai made her laugh daily, telling silly stories she heard from school and singing off-key songs that made Ebra cover her ears while smiling. After school, China and I would come running, arms wide, screaming, "Mummy," as though she hadn't seen Ebra in years instead of hours. The neighbors watched this closeness with a mixture of admiration and envy. No one could separate them. Even Obina, as involved and loving as he was, often joked, "My dear wife, I am jealous. This your daughter has taken over my position." Ebra would laugh and reply, "She is my answered prayer. Let her spoil me." They read stories together at night, lit a lantern when power was out, and huddled on the mat while Ebra narrated old folk tales of tortoise and wisdom. On weekends, they would walk to the village stream, carrying a small basin between them. China and I splashed in the water, giggling, while her mother washed clothes slowly and with intention. Every moment felt full. Every second felt important. Ebra had lived through many empty years. Now, she poured every drop of love into the child whose arrival had changed everything. As China and I grew, their bond deepened. When she fell sick with malaria one rainy season, Ebra stayed awake for 3 nights straight, bathing her with warm water, pressing a wet cloth on her forehead, whispering prayers through trembling lips. When she recovered, Ebra fasted for 3 days as thanksgiving. She never allowed her to walk home from school alone, even when the teachers said she was old enough. If China and I went to a friend's house, Ebra checked on her. Not because she was controlling, but because her daughter was her heart walking outside her body. They had inside jokes, secret handshakes, and a language only they understood. "I love you too much," Ebra would say. "Then pour it in a bowl," China and I would reply with a grin. And they would burst into laughter. It was a love story, not of lovers, but of a mother and daughter who had waited lifetimes to find each other. They were each other's world, and nothing in the stars warned them how quickly it would all be taken away. It was a Sunday evening, the kind that carried the smell of fried stew and the hum of old radio songs. The clouds were soft and orange, the village preparing to settle into nightfall. China and I had been coughing slightly, and Ebra insisted Obina take her to the chemist at the nearby junction to get malaria drugs. "Come with us, Mama," China and I begged, her small hands pulling at her wrapper. Ebra smiled and shook her head. "I need to finish cooking. You and your father go, and come back quickly." Obina lifted her into his arms and kissed Ebra on the cheek. "We'll be back in 30 minutes, he promised. Ebra watched them from the veranda, waving with a fond smile as they disappeared down the red earth road. The stew bubbled in the pot. The radio played softly. She sang a little tune under her breath and set the table, her heart full, completely unaware that her world was about to be shattered. The first scream she heard was distant, a child's voice. Then came the clanging of metal, the rising panic in the air. A neighbor ran into her compound, breathless and pale. "Ebra, come quickly," she shouted. Ebra didn't wait to hear more. She dropped her spoon, her heart pounding, her feet stumbling over themselves as she ran barefoot down the road. A crowd had gathered at the junction. She pushed through them, tears already burning her eyes. And then she saw it, the wreckage. A trailer had lost control and slammed into a small motorcycle carrying 2 passengers. The driver was already dead, and lying beside him, bloodied and still, was Obina. Not far from him was China and I, her body too quiet, too small for the chaos around her. Ebra fell to her knees, a wail escaping her that split the sky in half. "No, no, God, no," she screamed, crawling toward her family. Someone tried to pull her back, but she clung to China and I's lifeless body, rocking back and forth in a trance of sorrow. That night, the entire village went silent. Even the crickets didn't sing. Obina and China and I were buried side by side, wrapped in white cloth and tears. Ebra refused to leave the gravesite. She lay on the fresh soil, whispering her daughter's name over and over again. The fire in her heart extinguished. The laughter in her home silenced. For days she did not eat. For weeks she did not speak. People brought food, tried to console her, but she only stared into space. The same compound that once echoed with life now wept in silence. She tore the matching wrappers they once wore. She burned the stew pot. She smashed the radio. Everything reminded her of what she lost. And in that darkness, her heart began to rot with pain too deep for words. A mother who once laughed like a girl now sat under the mango tree, unmoving, a statue of grief, calling out to shadows in the night. Grief is a silent beast. It does not scream. It does not warn. It simply settles like a fog over the soul, making the air heavy and every movement feel like lifting stones with bare hands. For Ebra, every morning after the burial was a war against opening her eyes, a war against breathing, a war against the rising sun that dared to shine in a world where her daughter no longer lived. Her body moved like a ghost, her feet dragging across the dusty floor. She stopped sweeping. She stopped bathing. Her hair became tangled, her wrapper loose around her bony frame. Flies gathered around the compound, but she didn't notice. She sat on the same stool from dawn till dusk, her eyes fixed on the road where Obina and Chinanai had walked out that day and never returned. Sometimes she spoke softly to the air, recounting old memories to people no longer there. Chinanai, did you finish your homework? Obina, will you drink Gary, or should I make yam? But there was only wind, and wind does not answer. Her neighbors tried. They brought food, prayers, songs, and scripture. But how do you comfort a woman who has lost her everything in one cruel evening? The church women came, singing hymns and holding her hands. She didn't flinch. When the pastor visited and said, God gives and takes, she looked him in the eye and said, then he is cruel. That week, she tried to end her life. She drank a bottle of palm wine mixed with sleeping tablets, hoping to sleep and never wake. But her body rejected it. She vomited violently, and the neighbors found her passed out near the chicken coop. She was rushed to the clinic, revived, and returned home. But in her heart, something had snapped. She no longer feared death, she desired it. She stopped praying. She stopped smiling. The woman who once lit up a room with laughter, now moved like death itself, had borrowed her bones. Yet, in the midst of that darkness, life refused to fully let go of her. A child, small and persistent, began showing up at her compound, sitting silently nearby. At first, Ebra ignored her. Then one day, the girl spoke. Mama, your flowers are dying. Ebra turned, startled by the soft voice. The girl was barefoot, her dress torn at the edges, but her eyes sparkled with something Ebra hadn't seen in months. Life. That child was Adora. She would return day after day, never asking for anything, just sitting quietly or offering a mango or singing to herself. And slowly, something began to shift inside Ebra. She didn't smile, not yet, but she stopped crying every day. Adora reminded her of something, someone. Her voice, her walk, the way she always wanted to help. It was like watching a ghost, not in a scary way, but in a comforting, haunting way. Ebra didn't know it yet, but the seed of healing had been planted, and it wore dusty sandals and pigtails. The first time Ebra truly noticed Adora, she was sitting cross-legged near the compound's abandoned flower bed, humming softly while drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. It was an ordinary afternoon. The sun was stubbornly hot, and the dusty air hung still, but the girl's presence stirred something dormant in Ebra's soul. At first, she watched silently through the slit in her curtain, unsure what the little one wanted. But Adora came back the next day, and the next, always alone, always with her soft smile and large, questioning eyes. She never knocked. She just appeared, sat, and hummed her little songs, and left. There was no begging for food or money, no cries for attention. She simply existed in the widow's silence, like a candle placed gently in a dark room. And slowly, the suffocating weight of grief that had wrapped itself around Ebra like a shroud began to loosen. One day, after weeks of silent visits, Adora finally spoke again. "Why don't you come out any more?" she asked, swinging her feet beside the old basin by the doorway. Ebra blinked, surprised at how clear and calm the girl's voice was. She hesitated, but opened her door just a little and stepped outside. Her bones protested, but her heart felt curious. Because the world outside hurts, she muttered. Adora looked up and smiled. Then I'll come and sit here, and it won't be so bad. The next day, she returned with a hand-carved wooden spoon. My papa made this, but I want you to have it. It was the first gift Ebra had received in over a year. She took it, turned it over slowly in her hands, and something broke inside her. That night, she didn't cry, for the first time since the accident. Instead, she dreamt of China and I running through the yard with a little girl who looked exactly like Adora. In the days that followed, Adora became a constant presence. She would help sweep the dusty compound, pluck ripe guavas from the back tree, and sit beside Ebra, asking innocent questions about the sky and God and why mangoes fell only during certain seasons. Ebra answered with more patience than she thought she still possessed. The child didn't fill the void. No one could replace China and I, but she became a thread weaving its way through the torn fabric of Ebra's heart. Neighbors noticed the change. Mama Ebra was no longer the ghost woman who sat in silence. She began sweeping again. She started boiling rice and oil for two instead of one. She even brushed her hair once in a while. She didn't say it out loud, but the truth echoed in her soul. She had found something to live for again, even if it was just a child sitting under a mango tree, reminding her what light looked like. It happened on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day that would otherwise disappear into the forgotten folds of time. Adora came to Mama Ebra's house after school, her face blotched from crying, her uniform damp with sweat and dust. Her eyes, usually bright with mischief, were now red and hollow. Ebra, alarmed, rushed outside and held her by the shoulders. "What happened, my child?" she asked gently. Adora struggled to speak, her lips quivering. "They say I should not come back to school if I don't bring my fees. My mummy and daddy tried, but," she trailed off, sobbing uncontrollably. Ebra's heart cracked. The pain was too familiar. She had seen that same hopelessness in her own eyes in the mirror the day after she buried China and I. But this was different. This was a child. Her child now, in every way but blood. Without saying a word, she led Adora inside, fetched a cloth to wipe her tears, and sat with her in silence. Later that night, Ebra sat alone in her room, staring at the old wooden box under her bed. It had become a time capsule of sorts, a place where she stored the last remnants of her life before tragedy. Her two remaining wrappers, an old picture of Obina holding China and I in his arms, a bottle of unused perfume, and at the very bottom, a bundle of cash wrapped in nylon. She had saved it painstakingly over time. It was not much, but it was all she had. She had planned to use it for her burial expenses. "So no one will beg on my behalf when I die," she used to say. But now, staring at Adora's desperate face echoing in her mind, that money no longer seemed like it belonged to her. She pulled it out, unwrapped it slowly, and counted. 12,700 naira. Her entire savings. Tears ran freely as she folded the notes neatly into a white envelope. She placed it on her lap, took a deep breath, and whispered, "China and I hope you understand." The next morning, Adora came again, unsure if Mama Ebra would still want to see her. Instead, the old woman called her in, sat her down, and handed her the envelope. "Use it to go back to school," she said firmly. Adora opened it and gasped. "Mama, no, this is too much. I can't take it." Ebra smiled gently and pulled her close. "You are my child now. This is what mothers do. We give even when nothing is left." Adora wept into her shoulder, her small hands gripping the woman's back tightly. In that moment, something sacred passed between them, not words, not blood, but the raw, unfiltered love that only comes from sacrifice. Ebra didn't tell her it was her last savings. She didn't need to. The girl would find out one day. But for now, she simply kissed her forehead and said, "Go, and don't stop until you shine so brightly. The world can't look away." And Adora promised she would. From that day forward, Adora was no longer just the child who visited. She became the daughter Mama Ebra never expected to raise again. Their lives interwove with a beautiful ease, like two threads mending a torn cloth. Ebra began waking early to iron Adora's school uniform, pressing it carefully with an old charcoal iron. She packed her lunch, usually bread and groundnut or rice wrapped in leaves, and waited at the gate every afternoon for her return. In the evenings, they would sit together doing homework by kerosene lantern. Ebra, despite her fading eyesight and growing weakness, always tried to help. "This arithmetic is harder than farming," she'd joke, and Adora would giggle, correcting her gently. Sometimes the girl brought her school friends to greet Mama, and they all sat on the front steps eating boiled corn or groundnuts. For the first time in years, laughter returned to the compound, not loud, but soft and healing. The bond between them grew deeper with each passing month. Ebra taught Adora how to cook ogbono soup, how to sweep with short brooms, and how to greet elders properly. In return, Adora told her about school, about her dreams to become a nurse one day, and how she wanted to help people. Not just poor people, she would say, but the kind of people everyone forgets. Ebra would stare at her and smile, not because the girl reminded her of China, but because she was becoming something entirely her own. She was kind without asking for reward. She was intelligent, but humble. She asked questions, listened, and laughed from the belly. And most of all, she made Ebra feel alive again. The grief never fully left, but now it had company. A small girl who sat beside it and whispered hope. But time, like the wind, never stays still. And one day, change came knocking. Adora's father came to Ebra's home, hat in hand, eyes full of both gratitude and pain. "Mama," he said, "my brother in the city has agreed to sponsor Adora. They say she has a better chance there, better schools, more opportunities." Ebra's heart dropped. She nodded slowly, trying to smile, but the weight in her chest returned. That night, she sat in her room, holding Adora's old school shirt, the one she had washed and ironed 100 times. She folded it slowly, pressing it to her chest, her tears soaking into the fabric. "Not again," she whispered. "Not another goodbye." But this one was different. Adora wasn't dying. She was rising. And that made all the difference. Ebra didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the window and waited for the sun, hoping it would not take her light away forever. The day Adora left was one of those days when the sky looked undecided, neither sunny nor rainy, just dim and heavy, like it carried the weight of something unspoken. Mama Ebra sat on the edge of the bamboo bench outside her house, hands resting on her lap, watching as Adora's parents helped her pack her few belongings into a polythene bag. It wasn't much, a few dresses, a worn-out notebook, a pair of sandals that had more patches than sole. But it was everything Adora had. The child tried to be brave. She smiled, even hugged her mother and father tightly. But when she turned to Ebra, her eyes gave her away. The tears came instantly. She threw her arms around the old woman and whispered, "Mama, I don't want to go. Can't you tell them to let me stay?" Ebra's lips quivered. She held the girl tightly, her frail hands trembling. "You must go, my child," she said softly. "Your wings are here, but the sky is out there." After the car drove away, disappearing in a trail of dust and coughing engine sounds, the silence that returned to Ebra's compound was not just ordinary silence. It was a loud, echoing emptiness. She stood for several minutes, staring at the road, waiting as if the car might come back. But it didn't. Slowly, she turned and walked into her house, shutting the door behind her. The house smelled of soap and charcoal, and the faint scent of the girl's hair cream. Ebra sat on the mat where they used to do homework, and her eyes fell on a tiny pencil Adora had forgotten. She picked it up, stared at it, and then hugged it to her chest. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat curled in the corner of the room, holding the old school uniform she had folded days before. She rocked back and forth gently, whispering prayers that the city wouldn't take Adora's spirit away. Let her remain kind. Let her remember who she is. Let her remember me. The following weeks stretched into months. The compound was quiet again, too quiet. Ebra tried to fill the void with small routines. She swept the front yard, even though no feet now scattered the dust. She boiled rice in the mornings and saved an extra portion on the side, as though Adora might walk in hungry from school. The neighbors noticed her retreating again. She no longer laughed at their jokes. She rarely visited the market. She wore the same two wrappers over and over, one of which Adora had once washed and proudly hung on the line. At night, she would sit by the fire and speak out loud to the shadows. "She'll come back one day," she would say. "She'll be great. I'll wait." And that's what she did. She waited. Days turned to weeks, and weeks turned into years. But she waited, because that's what a mother does. Even when her bones hurt, even when her eyes dim, even when her heart is the only thing still whispering hope. The city that Adora had imagined in her dreams was not the city she arrived in. Instead of tall buildings and smiling strangers, she found herself in a cramped two-room apartment in a noisy part of town where buses screamed louder than humans, and the air smelled like burning fuel and forgotten dreams. Her uncle, who was meant to sponsor her, looked at her like she was baggage. "Make yourself useful," he grunted the first night. Her auntie didn't say much either, except to point out the bucket and mop she would be using. By the third day, Adora had already learned the rhythm of her new life. Wake before dawn, clean the entire house, fetch water from a far-off tap, wash clothes for the children who mocked her accent, and cook meals she wasn't allowed to eat. Only then could she think of school, and only if there was time. The scholarship application they had promised never came. And even when she begged to go to the nearest public school, she was told, "If you like school so much, teach the children at home." But Adora didn't break, not yet. In the quiet moments after scrubbing floors and before washing dishes, she would pull out her old notebook and write. She wrote about Mama Ebra, about the way the old woman braided her hair and sang songs that had no known artist. She wrote about the smell of the guava tree in the compound, about how silence in that home had felt safe, not cold. Sometimes she cried herself to sleep. Other times, she stayed awake just to whisper prayers that anyone, would come looking for her. She missed the village. She missed her mother and father. But most of all, she missed the woman who gave everything to give her a future. Every time her auntie shouted at her, or her uncle slammed the door in her face, she heard Mama Ebra's voice. "Don't stop until you shine so brightly. The world can't look away." That voice kept her sane. It kept her human. Eventually, Adora found a crack in the darkness. A small church nearby offered adult evening classes. The pastor's wife took a liking to her after seeing her help a crying child during service. With pleading eyes and folded hands, Adora asked if she could join the classes. The woman agreed. Every night, after her chores, Adora would sneak out with her notebook and learn basic math, English, and science. It wasn't much, but it was something. Her hunger for learning returned. She started excelling in the classes and even helped others. She told no one at home. And each time she wanted to quit, she would close her eyes and picture the way Mama Ebra had handed her that envelope, with trembling hands and fearless love. That image became her anchor. Adora made a vow in her heart. "I will become more. I will become everything that Mama Ebra hoped for, no matter what it cost." Years passed, and Adora grew from a soft-spoken girl into a young woman with fire in her eyes. Her body bore the scars of the life she had lived, calloused hands, stretch marks from malnourishment, and a back slightly bent from bending too often without rest. But her spirit remained unbroken. At age 17, she secured admission into a federal university to study medicine, thanks to a local youth empowerment scholarship organized through the church. She packed her small bag, the same one she had used to come from the village, and left without telling her uncle and aunt. She didn't need their permission. They had stopped being family long ago. When she got to campus, she cried, not because of fear, but because for the first time in years, she could breathe. She was finally somewhere she belonged. The rooms were cramped. The lectures were hard. But she was free. And for someone who had been a slave in her own bloodline's home, that freedom was priceless. University life was not easy. She barely had enough to eat, sometimes surviving on gari and groundnuts for days. She did small jobs, cleaning lecture halls, typing assignments for students, and helping in the library, anything to make a little money. But she never once considered giving up. In the evenings, she would go outside, look at the stars, and whisper, "Mama, I'm here." She didn't know if Mama Ebra was still alive. She hadn't heard from the village in years. Her parents had moved to another town, and communication was rare. But in her heart, she carried the old woman's voice like a sacred song. It was her compass. During her clinical postings, when she touched her first stethoscope, she wept. "This is for you, Mama," she said. "You gave me your last, so I could become this." At her graduation, she wore a second-hand gown and borrowed shoes, but she stood taller than anyone else in that hall. She didn't have parents screaming in the crowd or friends tossing confetti, but when she held her certificate, she closed her eyes and imagined one old woman clapping, with frail hands, whispering, "You did it, my daughter." And that was enough. Adora became known for her kindness in the hospital. She sat with dying patients. She hugged crying children. She treated everyone like they mattered. Her colleagues called her the soft fire, gentle but relentless. The world had tried to break her, bend her, bury her, but she had roots that reached deeper than pain. She never forgot where she came from, and she never stopped wondering if the woman who gave her hope was still waiting, somewhere in a quiet village, by a dusty road, whispering prayers for the girl who once called her Mama. The hospital where Adora worked was a modest government-owned facility on the edge of a bustling city district. It wasn't glamorous. The walls were chipped, the electricity unreliable, and the equipment outdated. But it was a place where lives were saved daily, and that was all Adora cared about. Her colleagues noticed how differently she approached her patients. She didn't just treat symptoms. She looked into people's eyes, listened to their fears, and spoke in a tone that made even the most hardened old men weep quietly into their pillows. She sat by dying mothers, cleaned elderly patients who had no family, and fed children with her own lunch. One night, her fellow doctor asked, "Why do you care so much?" She smiled gently, her eyes distant. "Because someone once cared for me when they had nothing." That's all she said. She never told them the full story. Never mentioned the old woman who gave her everything she had without asking for anything in return. In her small apartment, Adora kept a faded photograph tucked into the back of her Bible, a picture of her and Mama Ebra sitting outside the compound, both of them smiling into the camera with groundnut shells scattered around them. It was the only physical link to her past that she had left. She'd taken the photo during one of their happiest days together, with an old neighbor's phone. She had begged the woman to print it for her before she left for the city. The edges were curling, and the ink had begun to fade, but the memory remained alive. Every time Adora felt overwhelmed by the chaos of hospital life, the emergencies, the bureaucracy, the death, she'd touch the photograph and whisper, "I'm still trying, Mama." That photograph wasn't just a keepsake. It was her compass, her reminder of where her journey began and who it was truly for. She had never gone back to the village. Part of her feared what she might find. Was Mama Ebra still alive? Did she remember her? Could she still recognize her voice? The thought haunted her. Life had moved too quickly. Between school internship and the exhaustion of being a new doctor, time had slipped through her fingers. But her heart still pulled her toward that compound in the village, the dusty path, the mango tree, the bench where they used to sit. She planned to visit soon. She had started saving money for it, dreaming of walking in one day in her white coat, kneeling, and saying, "Mama, I kept my promise." But before that day came, something else would happen, something that would shake her to the core and test whether her training, her compassion, and her heart could survive the moment that was coming. Fate, as always, had its own timing. And this time, it wasn't waiting for her to catch up. It was a Friday morning, one of those mornings when the air felt too heavy, and the nurses moved slower than usual. The emergency room was unusually quiet until the silence was shattered by the loud screech of a vehicle's tires and the frantic shouts of two men dragging in a frail-looking woman wrapped in a faded wrapper soaked in blood. One nurse screamed. She was hit by a motorcycle, brought in from the outskirts. The commotion triggered immediate panic. Doctors scrambled, equipment was prepped, and patients were moved aside. Adora, already halfway through a shift, rushed forward to assist. The woman was unconscious, her breathing shallow, her body covered in bruises that hinted at far more than just the accident. Pulses weak. BP crashing, a nurse yelled. Adora leaned over the stretcher and began CPR immediately. "Get me a line." Prepare for fluids, she barked with urgency, sweat already pooling on her forehead. It wasn't the first emergency of the week, but something about this woman felt different. The woman's face was swollen, her left leg twisted unnaturally. She looked frail, too frail to survive this. As the team worked on her, trying to stabilize her vitals, another doctor leaned toward Adora and muttered, "We might lose this one. She's elderly, and there's signs of an underlying condition." But Adora refused to give up. "No, not on my shift," she said firmly. They rushed her into the surgical bay to run a series of tests. Hours passed. The woman had no known family with her. The two men who brought her had already left. Just a small bag sat near the stretcher, containing a torn wrapper and a small bottle of herbs. No ID, no phone, just her name, written shakily on an old referral note from a rural clinic. Ebra, Obina. Adora froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She reread the note again. The name, the handwriting, the age. Her knees buckled slightly. "No," she whispered as her hands began to tremble. Could it be? After all these years? She leaned over and studied the woman's face again, searching through the bruises and blood for something familiar. Her eyes traced the high cheekbones, the sunken eyes, the shape of the chin. And then it hit her. The scar under the jawline, barely visible. The scar Mama Ebra once said she got while climbing a mango tree as a child. Adora stumbled backward, hand covering her mouth. She felt like the walls were closing in. This wasn't just another patient. This wasn't just another case. This was her. Her. The woman who gave her life. The woman who raised her from the ashes. The woman who used her last breath to give her a future. Adora turned to the nurse beside her, her voice choked but steady. "I'm taking this case. I don't care who else is on duty. I'm not leaving her side." The nurse blinked. "Dr. Ada, are you okay?" She simply nodded and whispered, "I have to save her. She's my mother." Adora didn't leave the hospital that night. She didn't even change out of her scrubs. For over 12 hours, she hovered beside the fragile body of the woman who had once called her daughter. Her emotions battled inside her like a storm. Fear, guilt, hope, love, and an aching sadness. How had things gotten to this point? How had Mama Ebra ended up on a stretcher, half dead and alone? Where was her family? Where were the neighbors who used to greet her at the gate? The unanswered questions screamed in her mind, but there was no time to ask them now. The priority was survival. She rechecked the drip lines herself, adjusted the oxygen mask, and monitored the readings every 10 minutes. Nurses came and went. Some whispered that she was overreacting, too attached. But none of them knew the story, the sacred connection that bound her to the woman fighting for life in that bed. As the hours crawled on, Adora replayed every memory she had of Mama Ebra, the mango tree, the laughter over groundnuts, the late nights under lantern light doing schoolwork, the sound of her voice singing lullabies she never forgot. She remembered the way the woman gave her that envelope, trembling, but smiling, and the way she stood at the gate the day she left, eyes full of silent tears and pride. It all came rushing back, washing over her like a flood. "Please hold on," Adora whispered, sitting beside the bed and holding her frail hand. "I made it. I did it. I became what you dreamed, and I'm here now. But I can't do this without you. Please, Mama, don't leave me." She pressed her forehead gently against Ebra's hand and cried, not the loud sobs of a child, but the deep, shattering kind of tears that only years of buried love can summon. Just after midnight, something happened. The monitors beeped erratically. Adora's heart skipped. Nurses rushed in. "We're losing her," one shouted. Adora stepped in, adrenaline roaring through her veins. "No, not yet. Increase the fluids. Add oxygen pressure. Start the cardiac stim now," she barked, taking command of the room. Her hands were steady, but inside she was trembling. Seconds felt like hours. Everyone moved in synchrony under her lead. Then, slowly, miraculously, the vitals began to stabilize. The beeping normalized. The oxygen levels climbed. And then a flicker. Ebra's eyelids fluttered. Her fingers twitched. And with a weak breath, Her cracked lips parted, and she whispered, barely audible but unmistakable, "Ada, is that you?" Time stopped. Adora fell to her knees, overwhelmed. "Yes, Mama. It's me," she sobbed. "It's me, and I'm not letting you go." In that room, surrounded by monitors and white walls, two lives reconnected, one from the edge of death, the other from a lifetime of gratitude. And together, they began to breathe again. The days that followed were a delicate dance between hope and fear. Mama Ebra drifted in and out of consciousness, her body fragile, but her spirit clinging to life. Adora never left her side. She adjusted her work schedule, begged her superiors for flexibility, and even slept in the on-call room beside the ward just to remain close. Every morning, she held her hand, cleaned her face, and fed her soft pap when the nurses weren't looking. She refused to delegate care. "She's my patient," she repeated. But deep inside, she knew this was no ordinary medical case. It was a personal battle to repay a debt no money could ever cover. One evening, as the sun filtered softly through the ward window, Ebra opened her eyes again, this time longer. She tried to sit, but winced. Adora rushed over. "Easy, Mama. I'm here," she whispered, holding her shoulder. The older woman blinked several times and studied the face beside her. "You've grown," she said in a hoarse whisper. "You're Adora?" Adora nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, it's me, Mama. You're Adora. I never forgot." Her voice broke, and she lowered her head to Ebra's hand, kissing it softly. Ebra reached for her cheek with trembling fingers, brushing it like one would a porcelain doll. "I thought you'd forgotten me," she said. "I thought you were gone." Adora shook her head. "I've been searching in my heart every day. You saved me. You gave me a future when no one else could. I promised I'd make you proud." Ebra's eyes filled with moisture as she stared at the young woman before her, no longer a child in a torn uniform, but a full-grown doctor in white, strong and dignified. "And you did," she said. "You've always been mine." They sat in silence for a while, words replaced by emotion. Nurses walked past, some watching curiously, others respectfully turning away. No one dared interrupt the moment between a woman reborn and the child who carried her legacy. As the days progressed, Ebra's condition slowly stabilized. Her broken leg was set, her internal injuries managed, and her energy began to return bit by bit. Adora would wheel her into the hospital courtyard in the early mornings, letting the sun warm her frail skin. They spoke often, reliving old memories, the mango tree, the guava harvests, even the day Ebra gave her that envelope of savings. "That day, I didn't know if I would eat again," Ebra laughed softly. "But somehow, you fed me with every step you took forward." Adora smiled through her tears. "You gave everything for me. Now it's my turn." She had already begun arrangements, a private home nurse, a small flat near her own, and a care plan to ensure Ebra would never be alone again. Ebra protested gently, saying she didn't want to be a burden. But Adora silenced her with the same words Ebra had once said. "This is what daughters do. We give even when nothing is left." And now she was giving it all back. The day Mama Ebra was discharged from the hospital, the sky was bright, not the harsh, blinding brightness of a dry season sun, but the warm, golden hue of renewal. Nurses lined the hallway, watching quietly as Adora wheeled her out, both of them dressed simply, but radiating something more powerful than wealth: healing. Adora had prepared a small apartment just 5 minutes from her own, clean, safe, and decorated with simple things she remembered Ebra loved: a carved stool, a soft raffia mat, and even an artificial mango tree in the corner. Ebra protested, of course. "You've done too much," she murmured. But Adora only smiled and whispered, "You did more." In the weeks that followed, they created a new routine, one that mirrored the old days, but with roles reversed. Adora now cooked for her, read to her in the evenings, and made sure she never missed a meal or a dose of medication. The once sick, forgotten widow now woke up each day to love, laughter, and the warmth of the child she had once saved. Word of Adora's story spread, not because she told it, but because nurses spoke in awe of the doctor who fought to save a woman others had given up on. Some came to visit, Others cried. But Adora didn't do it for recognition. She didn't do it for praise. She did it because her soul owed a debt to the woman who gave her dignity before she knew her own worth. One evening, she brought Ebra a frame. Inside was their old photo, now restored and mounted beside a new one taken at the hospital. "We're still together," she said, placing it by her bedside. Ebra looked at the photos for a long time, then reached out and pulled her close. "You turned out better than I ever dreamed," she said. "You gave me more than I gave you." Adora shook her head and replied, "No, Mama. I'm just the seed you planted. You watered me with everything you had. And now I'm just trying to grow in your name." Years later, when Adora would look back on her life, all her medical accomplishments, her success, her own family and children, she would always say that everything began with one woman who gave her last when she had nothing. Not money, not connections, just love, the kind that plants something eternal in the heart of another. And whenever people asked how she learned compassion, how she became a doctor who treated patients like family, she would take a deep breath, smile gently, and say, "Because once upon a time, I was just a poor girl with no future, until a dying widow gave me her last savings and called me her daughter." And that would be the end of the story. Because the rest, as they say, wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the heart that refused to stop loving, even when everything else had been taken away. It belonged to Mama Ebra, the one who planted the seed. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.